Welcome back, dear traveler. Tonight, set everything else aside. Pull the blanket a little closer. Take a slow, deep breath, and let the worries of the day quietly fade away. For the next little while, there is nowhere else you need to be, only an ancient story waiting to be remembered. But before we begin, if you enjoy relaxing journeys through the world's greatest myths, consider subscribing to Mythborn and leaving a like. It helps keep these timeless legends alive, and you'll never miss another story. The god Wicho knew he would lose before the story begins. You need to know one thing that changes everything. Odin knows how he dies. He has always known. He knows the name of the wolf that will swallow him. He knows the exact moment. He knows what the sky will look like when it happens, what the air will smell like, how long the battle will last before the jaws close around him and the darkness comes. And he has known this since the very beginning of his existence. Every sacrifice he made, every eye he gave up, every night he hung bleeding on the world tree, every war he started, and every peace he brokered, every hero he loved and sent to die, every raven he released into the morning sky to gather intelligence about a future he already understood. All of it, every single act of his long and terrible life, was done by a god who knew that in the end, none of it would be enough. That is not a mythology story. That is the most human story ever told. Because every person who has ever lived has known on some level that the end is coming, that the things you love will be taken, that the world you built will one day crumble, that you will lose. And the question is never whether you will lose. The question is what you do with the time before. Odin's answer to that question is the greatest story in the history of human storytelling. And it begins not with a god on a golden throne, not with thunder and lightning and cosmic power, but with cold, absolute cold. A darkness so complete and a cold so total that even silence had not yet been born inside it. This is where Odin's story begins, and it will end with fire. And together, let us uncover the complete story of Odin, the All-Father. Chapter 1. The Void. Not emptiness in the way we understand emptiness. Not a dark room or a quiet night or an open field. Not the absence of things that could otherwise be there. True nothing. The Norse called it Ginnungagap, the yawning void. A word that sounds, even in English, like something vast opening its mouth. It had no edges. It had no floor. It had no sky because sky requires something to be above, and there was nothing to be above anything. How long it lasted is impossible to say, because time is a thing that requires events to measure itself against, and in a void with no events, time is simply a concept with nowhere to live. But in the old stories, the ones told in long houses through the howling dark of a Scandinavian winter, the storytellers say that two things, slowly, impossibly, began to exist at the edges of the nothing. To the north, ice. Not the thin ice of a frozen pond, not the ice of a harsh winter. Ice, the size of worlds, blue-black and dense as stone, ancient in the way that nothing else in existence would ever be ancient, because it formed before ancient had a meaning. The place that held it was called Niflheim, and from its heart ran 11 rivers, dark and cold, carrying something the old poets called Iter, a substance that is part venom, part cold, part the essential wrongness of something that should not exist but does. As the rivers flowed south into the void, the Iter froze on contact with the nothing, and the ice of Niflheim began to spread, one layer at a time, across the emptiness. To the south, fire. Muspelheim was not a place you could visit and survive. It was not a place you could approach and feel warm. It was the absolute concept of heat, given territory, where the fire was so complete and so fundamental that it made the fire of every hearth and every forge and every star in every sky look like a suggestion. And from its edge, sparks flew outward, small and bright, crossing the void and landing in the ice. For ages that had no name, the ice and the fire existed at opposite edges of the nothing. And then one day, the sparks from Muspelheim flew farther than they had before. They landed in the ice of the north, and where heat touched cold in the center of the void, something happened that had never happened before. Something melted. And from the meltwater, dripping slow and thick, like the first drops of a spring thaw, the first living thing emerged. Chapter 2. Ymir. He did not so much as arrive as he condensed. One moment there was meltwater. The next moment there was something in the meltwater, something vast and wrong and alive in a way that nothing had ever been alive before, because there was no template for what alive was supposed to look like, and so alive simply looked like whatever it wanted. His name was Ymir. He was the first giant, the first being, the first living thing in the history of existence, and he was enormous beyond any scale that later storytellers could properly convey, because he had not been made to fit inside a world. He had come before worlds. He was the size of everything that had ever existed before him, which was nothing, which means he was the size of the void itself. He slept. The cold that had made him was still present, surrounding him, and as he slept, the same meltwater that had formed him continued to drip and pool, and from it came another presence. A cow. Odhamla, the great cosmic cow, appeared from the ice the same way Ymir had, condensed rather than born, existing because the universe had decided that something needed to exist. She was enormous, though not as enormous as Ymir, and from her udders flowed 4 rivers of milk that ran continuously, and Ymir fed from them in his sleep, drinking the endless warmth of her without waking. And old Humbler herself had to eat something. She found salt. The ice around her was thick with mineral salt, the residue of the Itra rivers, and she began to lick it, slow and patient, working at a single block of ice with her great tongue, day after day, century after century. On the first day, she licked away enough ice to reveal hair. On the second day, a head. On the third day, a man. He stepped free from the block of ice she had slowly licked away, and his name was Buri. And he was beautiful in the way that the first of anything is beautiful, not because of specific features or specific grace, but because he was the first god. The first being in existence that had not come from the primordial code directly, but from the patient effort of another creature who had found something worth uncovering. Buri had a son. How, the old stories do not explain, because the old stories were not interested in explaining what they found less important than what came next. His son was named Bor, and Bor took a wife from among the giants, a giantess named Bestla, daughter of the frost giant Bolthorn. From Bor and Bestla came 3 sons. Their names were Odin, Vili, 3 brothers, born of both divine blood and giant blood, carrying in their veins the 2 oldest things in existence, the spark of something beyond the cold and the cold itself. But it is Odin whose story this is, and Odin was not content with a world that consisted of an endless, sleeping giant and rivers of milk and a cow licking salt blocks from a frozen void. He looked at Ymir, the vast unconscious first being who had simply grown and slept and eaten and grown some more, and he understood something that would define everything he ever did afterward. Some things that exist should not continue to exist in the form they have taken. Some things must be broken apart before anything new can grow. Odin understood this not as cruelty and not as ambition, though it would look like both. He understood it as necessity. And so, together with his brothers Vili and Vi, Odin killed Ymir. The giant did not go quietly. When the blood rushed from the wounds they had made, it did not merely fall. Ymir's blood was the primordial substance of the first living thing, and there was enough of it to drown entire generations. The deluge that poured from his body was so complete, so total, that every frost giant who had been born from Ym's body, for he had been generating life from himself as he slept, giants growing from his armpits and his feet, multiplying in the cold, every one of them drowned in that blood. Everyone except two. Bergelmir and his wife climbed onto what the old stories call a hollowed tree trunk, and they floated in the blood of the first giant while everything else died around them. And they survived, and from them the race of giants continued, nursing a grudge against Odin that would last until the end of time. The blood settled, and Odin, standing in the wreckage of the first living thing, looked at what he had. He had a body, and from a body he would make a world. Chapter 3. The Making of the World. This is the part of the story that should disturb you. Not because it is violent, you already know it is violent, but because of what it says about the act of creation itself. The world you live in, the ground beneath your feet, the sky above your head, every mountain and every sea and every cloud that drifts across the sun on a quiet afternoon, all of it, in the Norse telling, is made from a murdered body. Odin and his brothers did not create the world out of love or joy or even raw divine power. They made it out of what was available. Ymir's flesh became the earth. They lifted it and shaped it, pressed it flat where they wanted plains, pushed it high where they wanted mountains, tore through it where they wanted valleys. The flesh of the first being became the ground that everything else would ever walk on, the soil that every seed would ever push through, the dirt that every creature living and dying would ever return to. His blood became the seas and the rivers. The same blood that had drowned all the giants ran in channels and pooled in basins and gathered at the edges of the new earth, contained now rather than spreading endlessly, given banks and shores and the quality of depth that makes a sea feel like it has a bottom, even when it does not. His bones became the mountains. His teeth and the fragments of his shattered jaw became the stones and the gravel, scattered across the new earth in their millions, small, sharp reminders that underneath everything beautiful there is something older and harder. His skull became the sky. They lifted it above everything else and held it there, the curved dome of the first being's head becoming the dome of the heavens, and to hold it in place at the four corners of the world, they appointed 4 dwarves, Nordri, Sudri, Ostri, Vestri, north, south, east, west, 4 small immortal beings standing at the edges of creation, holding the skull of Ymir above their heads for all of time. Think about that the next time you look up at a blue sky. Think about what it is made of in the oldest telling. The sparks from Muspelheim that had drifted up into the nothing. Odin and his brothers gathered them and set them in the skull, and that is how the stars were made. Not placed with divine precision or mathematical care, but gathered and scattered, the way you might scatter seeds, and the ones that caught became the lights that every sailor would ever navigate by, every lover would ever stand beneath, every poet would ever stand beneath, every poet would ever gesture toward when they needed a metaphor for something that felt both beautiful and impossibly far away. Ymir's brain became the clouds. His eyebrows, the great ridged bones above where his eyes had been, became the walls that Odin built around the center of the new earth, the protected place where something new was meant to live. The old stories call that center blaze Midgard, the middle enclosure, the world meant for men. And then Odin looked at what he had made, and he understood that making the earth was the easy part. What he needed next was someone to put in it. Chapter 4. The First Humans. They found them on a beach. The 3 brothers were walking along the edge of the new sea, this vast and churning body of Ymir's blood that had been given shores and depth and the quality of restlessness that would make sailors love it and fear it equally for the rest of history. When they came across two trees, just trees, growing at the edge of where the land met the water, rooted in the flesh of the first giant, unremarkable in every way except for the fact that they were the only trees on a beach where nothing else was growing. An ash tree and an elm tree. Odin stopped. He looked at them for a long time. Then he gave them breath and life, the animating spark, the essential difference between something that exists and something that is alive. Vili gave them understanding and movement. V gave them blood and color, the flush in a cheek, the warmth of a body that has not yet understood the cold. The trees became a man and a woman. The ash became the man. Ask, they called him, the old word for ash, the tree that bends without breaking, the wood that absorbs impact, the tree whose roots go deep enough to touch water. The elm became the woman. Imbla, more uncertain in its root, something winding, something that coils around whatever it is near. They stood on the beach at the edge of the new sea, the first humans, and Odin looked at them the way a maker looks at anything he has just made, with a particular combination of pride and concern, understanding that what he has created will go on without him, will become things he cannot fully predict or control. He built them Midgard, the world enclosed by Ymir's eyebrows, protected by the giant's grudge being directed at the walls rather than at the people inside them. A place that was specifically designed to be survivable, to be livable, to be the ground on which the particular experiment of humanity could run. And then Odin went back to Asgard, the realm he had built for the gods, connected to Midgard and to all the other 8 worlds by the great world tree, Yggdrasil, whose branches held the realms and whose roots reached into the oldest and most terrible places in existence. But we are not ready to talk about Yggdrasil yet, because before we can understand what Yggdrasil means, we have to understand what Odin was willing to do to understand it. And what he was willing to do is the thing that defines him above everything else. Chapter 5. The Eye. Odin was the god of wisdom, but he was not born knowing everything. This is the part that the later, sanitized versions of mythology tend to skip because it is too uncomfortable. It suggests that divine knowledge is not given freely. It suggests that understanding has a cost. It suggests that the most important things you will ever know will not come to you easily, will not drop into your lap, will not arrive fully formed and convenient. They will cost you something you cannot get back. Odin knew this before he knew anything else. He knew it the way you know things that have not been taught to you but simply live in you, in the deep structural part of you that was there before your personality was, before your preferences and your memories and your name. He understood that there was a well at the roots of Yggdrasil in the territory of the frost giants. A well had existed since before the world tree itself had grown. Its waters ran deep into the earth, deeper than the roots of the tree, deeper than the oldest stone, touching something fundamental in the fabric of existence. The well was tended by a being named Mimir, sometimes described as a god, sometimes as something older and stranger than any god, a figure of such vast and quiet intelligence that even Odin was uncertain of his origins. What Mimir kept in the well was memory, not his own memory, not the memory of any single being. The well held the distilled knowledge of everything that had ever happened since the moment of the first ice, every event, every consequence, every pattern, every connection between causes and effects stretching back to the beginning of time and forward into futures not yet made. To drink from Mimir's well was to understand everything. Odin left Asgard. He traveled down through the roots of Yggdrasil, through the cold dark that lived between the worlds, to the place where the well sat, its water black and completely still, reflecting nothing, absorbing light rather than returning it. Mimir was there. He looked at Odin the way very old and very wise things look at the young and powerful, with patience that borders on amusement, understanding that whatever demand is about to be made has been anticipated for a very long time. "I want to drink from the well," Odin said. "I know," Mimir replied. "What is the price?" "This is the moment. This is the hinge on which everything turns." This is the thing to understand about Odin before you understand anything else. He did not hesitate. He asked the price because he intended to pay it, whatever it was. He had not come here with conditions or with the expectation of negotiation. He had come here already committed to whatever was required. Mimir looked at him for a long moment. "An eye," he said. "Not both eyes. One eye." The price of knowing everything was losing half of all visible light, walking forever in a darkness on one side, seeing the world as something incomplete, something that would always have a shadow falling across half of it. Odin reached up. He took out his own eye. He placed it in the well. It sank into the black water, and for a moment there was nothing. Just the sound of water and the cold, and Odin standing with blood running down his face, half blind, waiting. Then Mimir gave him the water to drink, and Odin understood everything. Not just what he wanted to know, not just the specific question he had brought with him. Everything. The past that went back to the ice and the void. The future that would end in fire. The names of the things that would kill his children. The date of the last battle. The exact and precise and unavoidable shape of the ending. He drank the water of total knowledge and learned that he was going to lose. That is the thing the storytellers want you to sit with for a moment. He paid the price of an eye. He gained the knowledge of everything. And the first thing that knowledge told him was that in the end, it would not be enough. He walked back to Asgard one-eyed and knowing. He had known, going into the well, that there were things he did not know. He had not known before he drank how terrible total knowledge would feel. He never drank from the well again. He did not need to. His eye sat at the bottom of Mimir's well for the rest of time, seeing everything, reporting nothing, a constant reminder of what was paid and what was learned and what was known. And Odin began to prepare. Chapter 6. The Hanging. But wisdom from the well was not enough. Even knowing everything that had happened and everything that would happen, Odin understood that knowledge and power are different things. That knowing the shape of a storm does not mean you can stop it. That understanding fate does not give you the tools to reshape it. He needed something else. He needed the runes. The runes were not merely an alphabet. This is where modern understanding goes wrong, reducing them to letters, to symbols carved on stones or tattooed on shoulders. In the Norse cosmology, the runes were the fundamental laws of reality itself, the actual structural principles that governed how existence worked, how cause produced effect, how intention could become outcome, how the seen and unseen worlds connected to each other. To know the runes was not to know a language. It was to know the code beneath the code, the grammar of reality rather than the grammar of speech. And the runes could not be learned. They could only be found. They lived in the roots of Yggdrasil itself, woven into the world tree that held the 9 realms together, and the only way to discover them was to go to a place where the boundary between living and knowing was thin enough to pass through. To find the runes, Odin would have to die. Not permanently, not finally, but genuinely. He would have to pass close enough to the other side that he could see the structure beneath everything, and he would have to come back from that place carrying what he had seen. Odin climbed the world tree. He climbed until the branches were thin enough to bend beneath his weight, and the ground below had become something theoretical rather than real, a concept of solidity far beneath him. He drew his own spear, Gungnir, the always accurate, the never missing, and drove it through his own side. He hung there 9 nights, no water, no food, no company. The world tree moved around him in winds that came from no direction, winds that existed between the worlds, between states of being, between what was alive and what was not. He hung in the cold of Yggdrasil, bleeding from the spear wound, moving in and out of consciousness. And each time he passed through the threshold of darkness, he passed a little closer to the place where the runes live. On the 9th night, he saw them, bursting up from the void below the tree, from the primordial depth that existed before anything else. The runes rose toward him like light rising through dark water, and Odin reached for them, grabbed them, seized them with a hand that was barely still a hand, and understood. He screamed. The scream of someone receiving knowledge the mind was not built to contain, the way a vessel screams when something is poured into it too fast, the pressure of understanding cracking against the walls of what had previously contained only unknowing. He fell from the tree, he landed, he was alive. He lay there for a long time, breathing, counting the rooms in his mind, touching them one by one, the way you check the contents of a bag after a long and terrible journey, confirming each one was real, each one had survived the fall, each one was truly his and not a dream produced by a dying mind. There were 18 fundamental laws of reality, each one a key to a specific aspect of existence: healing, binding, unbinding, seeing the unseen, stopping arrows mid-flight, waking the dead to speak, protecting ships at sea, making the land fruitful, understanding the hearts of enemies. Odin had sacrificed himself to himself. He had paid for knowledge with suffering on a scale that would destroy most beings. And he rose from the ground beneath the world tree and returned to Asgard one-eyed, rune-scarred, and more powerful than anything else in existence. But he was still not satisfied, because what Odin understood better than any other god was that there was always another price to pay, and always another thing worth knowing. Chapter 8. Frigg. Every account of Odin mentions at some point that his wife Frigg knows everything. Every account then mentions that she never tells anyone what she knows. If you want to understand the partnership between Odin and Frigg, you have to sit with that for a while. He paid with an eye and 9 nights of torture to learn the future. She simply knows it. She was born knowing it, or grew into knowing it gradually, or arrived at it through some means that no story fully explains, because Frigg's origins are murky in the way that things that have always been present are murky. She was simply there, and she knew what she knew, and she kept it to herself. Why? The old scholars have argued about this for a very long time. Was she protecting people from the pain of knowing? Was she testing whether events would unfold as she foresaw them without her intervention? Was she simply respecting the integrity of fate, understanding that knowledge of a future event and the power to change it are not the same thing? Or was she more pragmatic than all of that? Did she simply understand that there are some things you cannot change by speaking them, and that speaking them only causes suffering without preventing anything? Odin knew the future from Mimir's well. Frigg knew it from whatever private source of foreknowledge she carried. Neither of them spoke about what they knew, most of the time. What they had between them was not what the stories call love, in the simple sense, because Odin was famously unfaithful, famously wandering, famously complicated as a partner. He had children by giantesses and by human women and by other goddesses. He was absent more than he was present. He moved through the world in disguise, pursuing knowledge and power and connection that he did not report back to anyone. Frigg was always in Asgard. In Fensalir, the Hall of the Fens, she sat at her spinning wheel, and what she spun on it, the old stories hint at without explaining, suggesting that the work of her wheel was connected to the fate threads that the Norns wove, that her spinning was not merely decorative or domestic, but structural and cosmic. She sent out her handmaidens across the worlds, Fulla, who knew all her secrets and kept them, Nay, who carried messages on a horse that could ride through air and water, Hlin, who protected those Frigg wished to protect, each one an extension of herself, an outreach into worlds she observed from Fensaler. What the partnership between Odin and Frigg produced, that particular combination of his willingness to go anywhere and do anything to understand the world, and her quiet, unmoving, unspeakable foreknowledge, was something like a complete picture of existence. He knew what had happened and most of what would happen. She knew all of what would happen. Together they knew everything, and together they said almost nothing. What they agreed on was silent. What they disagreed on was also largely silent, until their son was born, until Balder came into the world and the silence between his parents became something unbearable. But we are not ready for Bald yet. There is too much to understand first. There is the matter of Odin's companions, and the matter of the first war, and the matter of the mortal heroes, and the matter of Valhalla, and the matter of the dark place the story is always moving toward. All of it must come before Bald, because Bald is where everything begins to end, and you cannot understand an ending without understanding what came before. Chapter 9. Hugin and Munin. Every morning before dawn, two birds left Asgard. Ravens. Black, impossibly black, with a black that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, with eyes that were too intelligent and a presence that was too purposeful for anything that should technically be a bird. Their names were Hugin and Munin, thought and memory, not named for the concepts as decoration, named because that is what they were, not birds that represented thought and memory, but thought and memory themselves, given wings and sent out into the 9 worlds each morning to gather what they could gather and return by evening to the shoulders of the god who needed to know everything. They flew to Midgard, where they circled over human settlements and battlefields and farmsteads and harbors. They flew to Jotunheim, where the giants made their plans in cold stone halls. They flew to the edges of the known worlds and into the places between worlds where things that had no name moved in the dark. They saw, they heard. They came back every evening to Asgard, landing on Odin's shoulders, one on the left and one on the right, and they whispered into his ears everything they had collected across the span of a day. Thought on the right, memory on the left. The god of wisdom, already one-eyed from the price he had paid at the well, sitting in his high seat Hillagouth that looked out over all the 9 worlds, receiving the reports of his own mind made external, his own memory given wings to go places he could not. The old poem that survives from the Norse tradition is unexpectedly tender at this point. Odin says, "I fear for Hugin that he may not return. Even more I fear for Munin." He fears for thought. He fears more for memory. A god who knows everything, who has paid more for wisdom than any being in existence, who sits in the high seat and sees all the worlds, and what he is afraid of losing is not his throne, or his eye, or his power. He is afraid of losing his capacity to remember. Think about what that tells you about Odin. Think about what a being who is genuinely afraid of losing memory is actually afraid of. He is afraid of losing the ability to carry the dead with him. Every fallen warrior he had chosen, every hero he had loved and sent to death, every sacrifice he had witnessed, every price paid and every lesson earned. If Munin did not come home, all of that would become inaccessible, would exist somewhere in the world beyond reach, would be real, but unreachable. He feared forgetting more than he feared the wolf. He also kept wolves, Jerry and Frecky, the greedy one and the ravenous one, 2 wolves who lay at his feet or ran alongside him, who were fed whatever meat was brought to Odin's table because Odin himself ate nothing. He drank only the mead of poetry, sustaining himself on wisdom and distilled inspiration rather than on ordinary food. He fed his share to the wolves. The god of death and war and wisdom, sitting with the tools of knowledge on his shoulders and the tools of appetite at his feet, eating nothing, sustaining himself on something that was never meant to be food. Chapter 10. The Horse from a Trick Loki. The name arrives in this story like a stone dropped into still water, not violent in itself, but capable of producing ripples that touch every shore. Loki was not Odin's son. He was Odin's blood brother, which is different in a way the old stories spend very little time explaining, because the relationship between these two was not the kind that needed to be explained. It was simply present, established before the stories begin, binding them together in ways that would eventually produce both the best things Odin ever had and the worst things that ever happened to him. But before we arrive at the darkness Loki would eventually produce, there was a horse. In the early days of Asgard, when the realm was new and still being built, a man came to the gods with an offer. He was, in fact, a giant in disguise, but he presented himself as a builder, a craftsman of extraordinary skill, and he proposed a contract. He would build a wall around Asgard so powerful and so complete that no giant or dark force would ever be able to breach it. The payment he asked for, if he completed the wall within a single winter with no assistance, was 3 things: the goddess Freya as his wife, and the sun and moon taken from the sky. The gods were not entirely comfortable with this. Freya was not a piece of property to be traded, and the sun and moon being removed from the sky would end all life in Midgard as an obvious consequence. But Loki persuaded them that the terms were acceptable, the key being that the builder had to complete the work alone and without help in a single winter, which seemed impossible. What no one had anticipated was the builder's horse. He had a stallion named Svadilfari, a horse of supernatural strength and speed, and with this horse hauling stones twice the size of any man could move, the wall went up at a pace that made the gods' palms damp with the beginning of real concern. 3 days before winter's end, the wall was almost done. If it was completed, the terms would need to be honored. Freya would go to the giant. The sun and moon would come down. The gods came to Loki. They reminded him, with considerable urgency and very direct language about consequences, that he was the one who had persuaded them to accept this arrangement, and that he was therefore responsible for finding a way out of it. Loki went away and came back in a different form. He came back as a mare, a beautiful mare, who appeared at the edge of the forest near the construction site and displayed herself to Svadilfari with precisely the kind of behavior that would produce the exact result Loki needed. The stallion bolted after the mare. The builder chased both of them through the forest all night and lost the remaining construction time, and the wall was not finished before winter ended. The builder, realizing he had been cheated, revealed his true form in his rage and was promptly killed by Thor, who had been conspicuously absent during the contract negotiations and returned at a convenient moment. Loki returned from the forest some months later, and he was carrying a foal, 8-legged, gray, already showing signs of the supernatural speed that would make it the fastest thing in any of the 9 worlds. The foal's name was Sleipnir. Loki, who had conceived a horse while in the form of a horse with a giant stallion, gave the foal to Odin. Odin accepted. He rode Sleipnir across the sky and into the underworld and between the worlds, the 8-legged gray horse that could travel anywhere, that could cross into Hell's realm while still living and return, that could carry its rider at speeds that made the wind feel stationary. It is, even by Norse mythology standards, one of the stranger origin stories, but it is also, in its way, a perfect illustration of how the relationship between Odin and Loki worked. Loki's appetite for chaos and his contempt for boundaries produced things that were genuinely useful, genuinely powerful, genuinely transformative, and extracted a cost that was also genuinely strange. The cost here was borne by Loki himself. It would not always be that way. Chapter 11. The first war before Odin had finished building Asgard. Before the walls were properly settled, before the peace was properly established, there was a war. It was the first war, and it began, as so many wars do, with magic and with misunderstanding. There existed, outside of Asgard, a separate divine family, the Vanir, where the Aesir were associated with law and war and the ordered structures of civilization. The Vanir were older, wilder, associated with the deep earth and the sea and the kind of magic that does not follow rules, the magic of growth and decay and desire, the magic that lives in the body rather than the mind. Their magic was called Sidor, and among the Aesir it had a complicated reputation. A woman came to Asgard. Her name in the stories is Halin, though the poets hint that this was not her only name. She was a Vanic witch, a practitioner of Sidor, and she arrived in Asgard and began practicing her art and charging for it, and the gods found that she was very good at what she did and very difficult to resist. She caused trouble. The exact nature of the trouble varies depending on which telling you follow. Some say she corrupted the gods. Some say she stirred desire where it wasn't meant to be stirred. Some say she simply represented an intrusion of a different and incompatible power into a system that hadn't been designed to hold it. The gods decided to kill her. They killed her 3 times. Each time she came back, and the Vanir, hearing that their kinswoman was being killed and resurrected and killed again in a foreign realm, took this as the insult it was. War came. The 2 sides met in the space between their worlds, and they fought with the full weight of 2 divine families going at each other without restraint. The Aesir fought with weapons and will. The Vanir fought with the deep old magic that could turn air into stone and stone into water and desire into a weapon more effective than any spear. The wall of Asgard was breached. Thor was not yet the defender of Asgard's walls. That role would come to him later as the walls grew stronger and the threats from Jotunheim became more constant. In this first war, the defense of Asgard fell to everyone, and everyone fell short. The Vanir attacked from one direction, breaking through the defenses. The Aesir counterattacked, pressing into Valhalla. Back and forth the war went, neither side able to fully destroy the other, neither side willing to accept a stalemate. Eventually they stopped, not because one side won, because both sides were exhausted, and because there was a more pragmatic arrangement available to beings who were not going to die of old age and could simply choose not to fight anymore. Peace. Hostages were exchanged to seal it. From the Vanir came Nord, the god of the sea, and his children, Freya and Freyja. These 3 would become full members of the Aesir court, bringing with them the magic of the Vanir, the old earth magic, and the particular power over desire that Freyja especially carried, a power that would matter enormously in the long unfolding of what was to come. In exchange, the Aesir sent Mimir and a god named Honir to Vanaheim. Hunter was tall and impressive and said very little. Menir was the ancient keeper of the well, wise beyond any ordinary measure, and when the Vanir asked Honir for counsel on any matter, Honir always deferred to Mimir, who always gave the right answer. This worked beautifully until Mimir was absent. Without Mimir, Odin's response to any question was a variation of, "I don't know, decide among yourselves." The Vanna, realizing they had been given an impressive-looking but independently useless god as their primary exchange, felt cheated. They cut off Mimir's head, descended back to Asgard. Odin received the head of one of the oldest and wisest beings in the 9 worlds. He embalmed it with herbs. He spoke runes over it. Mimir's head could still speak, and Odin went to it in private, in the moments when he needed counsel beyond what even his single eye and his rune knowledge could provide, and asked his questions. The head answered. The relationship between Odin and Mimir continued after Mimir's death, the way relationships between beings of genuine depth sometimes do, the conversation continuing even after the ordinary terms of conversation have technically ended, and the war between the Aesir and Vanna settled into the uneasy peace that would hold, more or less, until the end of everything. Chapter 12. Valhalla. Every morning in Valhalla, the dead woke up, not like a nightmare. Not confused, not frightened, not uncertain about where they were. They woke up the way warriors wake after a battle they somehow survived, knowing exactly where they are and already reaching for the weapon that should be in arm's reach. The weapons were there. Valhalla was not paradise in the way later traditions would define paradise. It was not peaceful. There were no clouds, no gentle music, no eternal rest. Rest was specifically the one thing Valhalla was not for. The dead of Valhalla fought every day. From dawn until the late afternoon, the Einherjar, the chosen warriors, the ones Odin had specifically selected from the battlefields of Midgard, went out into the great field of Valhalla, and they fought each other. Full combat. Spears and swords and shields and the genuine intention of harm, because you cannot train for a real battle with pretend commitment. At the end of the fighting, the fallen rose again. Their wounds closed. Their blood returned to their bodies. They stood up, whole and alive, if alive is the right word for beings who had already died once and were now living again in the hall of the dead. They went inside. They sat at the long tables of Valhalla, and they feasted on the meat of the boar Saehrimnir, who was slaughtered every night and was whole again by morning. And they drank mead that flowed from the udder of the goat Hedron, who ate leaves from the branches of Yggdrasil and produced enough mead to fill a great vat that never ran dry. And the Valkyries, Odin's couzers of the slain, served them through the night. And then morning came, and they did it again. This was not punishment. This was preparation. Odin was building an army. The most specific, deliberately selected, carefully cultivated army in the history of any world. An army of the best warriors who had ever lived in Midgard, chosen not because they were the most famous or the most celebrated, but because Odin had watched them die and had seen in the moment of their death the particular quality that he needed. People who would keep fighting even when they knew they were losing. He had seen that quality from his high seat. He knew it when he saw it. He needed it because he had seen what was coming. He needed an army of people who could keep fighting against an enemy that they knew would win. He needed warriors who would face the wolf. The Valkyries who served in Valhalla and who rode over the battlefields of Midgard, choosing which warriors would die, they were not neutral arbiters. They were instruments of Odin's will, selecting specific people for specific reasons, guiding the course of battles with a precision that looked like fate but was actually policy. They rode on horses that could travel between worlds and across water and through air. They wore armor and carried spears. They were beautiful in the particular way that power made irresistible, is beautiful, and the men who saw them in the moment before death, riding through the field with their horses' manes glittering, must have understood that being chosen was something other than merely dying. Brynhildr was among them before her story became something different. Gundul and Skogul and Girskogul, the names of the Valkyries, each one meaning something: battle wand, tree of the sword, spear of battle, shaker, chooser. Odin did not merely send them out. He directed them. He chose his warriors personally, and the Valkyries executed his choices. He was building his army for Ragnarök, and every great warrior who died in battle in Midgard was either claimed by him for Valhalla or claimed by Freyja for Folkvangri, the field where the goddess of desire and war took her half. The half who went to Freyja would also fight at Ragnarök. Everyone was preparing, whether they knew it or not. Chapter 13. The Wander. He did not stay in Asgard. This is the thing about Odin that the later images, the king on the throne, the great patriarch surrounded by gods and warriors, get fundamentally wrong. Odin was a wanderer. He put on the gray cloak and the broad-brimmed hat, took up the walking staff, and he walked, through Midgard especially, but through all the worlds, through Jotunheim despite the giants' enmity, through Alfheim and Nidavellir and the edges of Muspelheim. He walked because knowledge cannot be acquired from a high seat. Knowledge has to be found, and found in the places that a god on a throne would never think to look. He came to human settlements in the guise of different people. An old man who wanted to sleep by the fire, a trader with strange things to sell, a storyteller who knew too many stories, a soldier who had seen too many wars. He tested people, not in the sense of trials designed to produce heroes. He tested them the way anyone tests anything, by putting pressure on it to see where it holds and where it gives, by pushing against the joints to find the weak ones. He was not always kind. The stories of Odin's wanderings in Midgard are full of moments of what looks like cruelty but is, in his accounting, simply the rigorous application of consequences. He gave knowledge to those he judged worthy. He gave victory to those he chose in battle. He took victory away from kings he had previously favored when he decided the time had come for those kings to join his army in Valhalla. He was inconsistent by human standards. By his own standards, he was perfectly consistent. He was always doing what the end required, the end he was preparing for. In one of the old stories, two kings, Agnar and Geirwitha, are both under Odin's influence. He favors Geirwitha. Frigg favors Agnar. They bet on whose favored king will fare better. Odin comes to Geirwitha's hall in disguise as a wanderer, and Geirwitha Stan, who has been told by Loki. Loki again, always at these intersections that the wanderer is a dangerous sorcerer, has him captured and tortured. He is hung between two fires for 8 nights. Odin, between two fires for 8 nights. The echo of the 9 nights on Yggdrasil is not accidental. He reveals himself eventually, speaks the secrets of the runes and the knowledge of the worlds to the court, and the king dies on his own sword when he lurches to free the god. Frigg had been right. Odin does not admit this exactly, but the story survives, which suggests something about what it means to tell stories about the things you lost. He also appeared to humans he intended to shape, to heroes whose bloodlines he needed, whose futures were already woven into the tapestry of what was coming, who needed to be set on specific paths that they would not arrive at without his push. He gave weapons to some of them, the sword that could not miss, the spear that no defense could turn aside. He took the weapons back when the time came. This is the hardest thing about Odin in his relationship to humans. He loved his heroes. As genuinely as a being like him could love, he invested in them, visited them, shaped them, gave them gifts and opportunities and knowledge. He felt something when they fought and when they fell. And he always took back what he had given when the moment came for them to die and join him. Because he needed them more in Valhalla than in Midgard. Because the army was always more important than any individual. because the end was always closer than anyone else could see. Chapter 14. The Volsung Saga. No story better illustrates how Odin moved through human history, not as a distant divine force, but as an active participant who planned in generations and accepted terrible costs as the price of specific outcomes. Than the Volsung Saga. It begins with a sword. A wedding feast, long tables, torches, music, the smell of roasted meat and spilled ale, and the particular warmth of a hall packed with people celebrating. Into the center of the hall walked an old man. Grey cloak, broad hat, one eye. He said nothing. He simply walked to the great oak tree that grew through the center of the hall. Brandstock, the living heart of the Volsung clan's hall, the tree that had been there before the hall was built around it, and he drove a sword into the trunk up to the hilt. Then he looked at the assembled company. "Whoever draws this sword from the tree shall have it as a gift from me," he said. "And that person shall find that they have never carried a better weapon." He left. Everyone understood who had been in the hall. Every man tried to pull the sword. Strong men, famous men, warriors of genuine reputation who had proven themselves in real battles. Each one gripped the hilt and pulled, and the sword did not move. And each man stepped back quietly, not angry, not frustrated, but with the particular expression of someone who has just confirmed something about themselves that they suspected but hoped was wrong. At last, the youngest of the Volsung sons stepped forward. Sigmund. He gripped the hilt the way you grip something you have been waiting to hold your entire life, without thinking too hard about whether you can do it, and he pulled. The sword came free. What followed from that moment, the generations of the Volsung line, the rise and fall and rise of heroes who carried Odin's gifts and paid Odin's prices, is one of the great tragic epics in world literature. A story that was eventually transformed into the Ring of the Nibelung, and that echoes still in every story about chosen heroes and divine favor and the terrible cost of greatness. Sigmund fought battles no ordinary man should survive, because Odin was with him. Odin took the sword back when Sigmund's time had come. In the last battle of his life, fighting against impossible odds, Sigmund's sword shattered when it struck a spear carried by an old man in a grey cloak who had stepped between Sigmund and his enemy. Sigmund understood. He lay dying, and his wife Haukantudis knelt beside him, and he told her, "Do not grieve. Odin is done with me. He wants me now for his hall. But keep the pieces of the sword. Have them reforged for my son." He had a son, not yet born. Eordis kept the pieces. The son was born. His name was Sigurd, and the reforged sword was called Gram, and Sigurd killed the dragon Fafnir with it, and bathed in dragon's blood, and ate the dragon's heart, and understood the speech of birds. And the birds told him where to find a sleeping woman surrounded by fire, and the sleeping woman was a Valkyrie named Brynhildr. And what happened between them, and what Loki's magic did to Sigurd's memory, and the disaster that followed. All of that flows from the moment Odin drove a sword into a tree. Odin had planned it, not the specific disaster, not the specific grief, but the shape of the bloodline, the arc of the heroic life, the kind of man who would emerge from that particular combination of gifts and costs and losses. He was always building toward Ragnarök. Every hero was a brick in the army he was constructing. The heroes died young, tragically, in circumstances that Odin could often have prevented. He chose not to prevent them. He needed them on the other side. Chapter 15. The Giants and the Wander. The giants hated Odin. This requires some qualification. They did not hate him the way you hate an enemy who has wronged you. They hated him the way you hate a force of nature that has permanently altered your life, with a grudge that is also a kind of awe. with resentment that is also a kind of respect. He had killed their ancestor. He had made the world from their ancestor's body. He had filled that world with beings made from trees and connected them to a great world tree whose roots touched the primordial well where Ymir's blood still pooled in the earth. And then he visited them constantly, not as conqueror, as wanderer. He came to Jotunheim in disguise, the way he came to Midgard in disguise, looking for knowledge, looking for the beings who possessed specific kinds of wisdom that the gods did not have, because the giants, despite being enemies, were also the oldest creatures in existence after the first ice, and they had knowledge that predated Asgard and predated the Aesir and went back to the dawn before dawns. He engaged them in contests of wisdom. Sit across the fire from the old All-Father and answer riddles or propose riddles of your own, and whichever of you runs out of answers loses. He sometimes lost these contests, in the sense that the giant he was contesting against posed a question he could not immediately answer. Then the ground shifted, because Odin cheated. He always cheated, not dishonestly exactly. He cheated in the way that someone with vastly more knowledge than their opponent always cheats. He asked questions from the deep reservoir of total wisdom that he had purchased at Mimir's well, and when a question arose that exceeded his knowledge, he asked something to which only he knew the answer. What did Odin whisper into the ear of Baldur on the funeral pyre? He asked the giant Fafrukrusruna, after a long contest in which the giant had been impressively holding his own. Vafthrudnir paused. He looked at the old man across the fire with one eye. He was silent for a very long moment. Then, I do not know what you whispered into your son's ear. Only you know that. He understood. He had been testing Odin without knowing he was testing Odin, and Odin had just confirmed his identity in the most elegant possible way, by asking a question whose answer was a secret that could only be verified by the person who knew it. The giant accepted his defeat with something that the old poem suggests was close to admiration. I have been arguing with Odin, Bofrektursna said. I should have known. No one else in any of the 9 worlds seeks this kind of knowledge this relentlessly. Odin moved through the giant world this way, taking what he needed, giving occasional gifts, always moving, always building the understanding of the world that his eye and his runes and his mead gave him the capacity to hold. He also had relationships with giantesses that produced children, not in the casual Zeus-style fashion that later myth sometimes presents, with genuine complexity, with specific purpose. His son with the giantess Rinda was Bali, born for a specific purpose, which we will come to. His relationship with Grether produced Vidar, the silent god, the god who barely speaks, who sits in Asgard preparing for a single action that has been prepared for since his birth. Even Odin's romantic choices were strategic. Even his moments of desire were organized around the end he was always preparing for. Chapter 16. The Shapping of Thor. The most famous of Odin's sons was born from the union of Odin and the earth herself. Worth, the earth, giantess, primordial, older than Asgard, older than the Aesir, connected to Ymir's flesh that was the ground beneath everything. From this union came the loudest thing in any of the 9 worlds. Thor, red-bearded, impossibly strong, with a temper that moved from calm to volcanic at a speed that left almost no intermediate state. Thor was in every way the most obvious god who had ever existed. He could not have wandered in disguise the way Odin did. When Thor was in a room, every person in the room knew it. Odin understood this about his son. He also understood that the role Thor would play did not require subtlety. What it required was the willingness to face giants, to stand between Asgard and Jotunheim's endless appetite for conquest and simply hold the line. to be the immovable fact of defense, the answer to the constant and escalating giant threat that Odin's strategic long game could not always address. Thor was given Mjolnir. The hammer had been forged by the dwarves Brokkr and Sindri under complicated circumstances involving Loki transforming into a fly and biting Brokkr's eyelid at the worst possible moment, which is why the handle came out shorter than intended. The handle length is a source of some ongoing sensitivity. It returned to his hand after every throw. It crushed anything it struck. It could not be broken. There is a version of the father-son relationship between Odin and Thor that is purely functional. The great king and his strongest general, using each other for the purpose each was designed to serve. But there is another version, quieter, that you find in the smaller details of the stories. Odin went to extraordinary lengths to ensure that the information and allies and weapons Thor would need at Ragnarök were in place. He shaped the environment his son would fight in. He prepared the ground. He did not tell Thor what he had seen at Mimir's well. He did not tell his son that on the day the serpent finally rose from the sea, Thor would kill it and take 9 steps away from its body before the venom brought him down. 9 steps, like the 9 nights on the world tree. The number that appears again and again in these stories, the number that means the distance between one state of being and another, the measure of how far you can go after doing the thing that costs everything. Thor would take those 9 steps. And Odin, who had known since Mimir's well that those 9 steps were the most his son would have, shaped everything around, giving his son the best possible chance to take them. This is the thing about Odin as a father that the later stories, focused on his majesty and his wisdom and his power, tend to underemphasize. He loved his children, in the particular, terrible way of someone who loves what he knows he cannot save. Chapter 17, Loki's Children. Odin made a mistake. Not the kind of mistake that comes from being wrong about something, because Odin was almost never wrong about anything in the factual sense. He had drunk from the well. He knew things. He understood causes and consequences with a precision that exceeded any other being in existence. The mistake he made was the kind that comes from knowing something and choosing not to act on it, because acting on it would mean doing something you find unbearable. Loki had children, not with his wife Sigyn, who was faithful to him and who the stories barely mention except at the end, with a giantess named Angrovida, the one who brings grief. He had 3 children that the Norns and the Fates and every omen Odin had ever read said would be catastrophic. A wolf, a serpent, a daughter who was half living and half dead. The wolf was Fenrir. The serpent was Jormungandr, the Midgard serpent. The daughter was Hel. Odin had Mimir's knowledge. He knew what these 3 children were capable of. He knew what Fenrir would do on the last day. He knew what Jormungandr would do when it finally released its own tail. He made a choice. He ordered the children brought to Asgard not to kill them, not because he was naive about what they were, but because killing Loki's children, killing them when they had done nothing yet, when they were still essentially innocent beings whose only crime was being born with certain destinies, was something Odin could not bring himself to do, even knowing what he knew. Perhaps this is the most human thing about him. He took the serpent and cast it into the ocean, into the sea that encircled Midgard, dropping it into the deep dark water where it sank and kept sinking, and in the cold and the pressure and the dark at the bottom of the world's ocean, Jormungandr grew. It grew for ages. It grew until its body encircled all of Midgard, and when it grew long enough, it found its own tail and closed its jaw around it, and there it lay, the Midgard serpent, encircling the world, neither sleeping nor truly awake, waiting. He sent Hel to the underworld, to the realm that would take her name. Helheim, the realm of the dead who did not die in battle, the ordinary dead who neither earned Valhalla through their deaths nor were claimed by Freya. Hel ruled that realm with a quality that the old stories called neither cruel nor kind. She simply was. Her realm simply was. The dead who came to her stayed. And the wolf. The wolf was the one that could not be so easily managed. Fenrir was brought to Asgard, and as a pup he was manageable, and the gods allowed him to remain, and it was Tyr, the god of justice, the one-handed god, who had the courage and the patience to go each day and feed Fenrir as the wolf grew, who maintained any kind of relationship with the animal. He grew, with every day Fenrir grew. And Odin, who knew from Mimir's well that this particular wolf was the thing that would kill him, watched it grow and did not kill it, because killing a being that has not yet done the thing you fear it will do is a different kind of thing than the strategic violence Odin was capable of. They tried to bind him. They brought chains forged by the Aesir's best smiths, Lyding and Dromi, and Fenrir broke them easily, almost amused, testing and finding them inadequate. The gods went to the dwarves of Nidavellir. The dwarves made Gleipnir. It looked like nothing. A ribbon. A thin silk thread, pale and soft, the kind of thing that ought to tear in a light wind. But the dwarves had made it from impossible materials. The sound of a cat's footstep, the beard of a woman, the roots of a mountain, the sinews of a bear, the breath of a fish, the spittle of a bird. Things that do not exist, made into a binding that cannot be broken. Then Rive looked at the ribbon with deep suspicion. He was not a stupid wolf. He understood that something so fragile-looking that had been made specifically to test his strength was almost certainly more dangerous than the chains that had already failed to hold him. He agreed to submit to the test, but only if one of the gods put a hand in his mouth while he was bound, as a gesture of good faith, as a pledge that if the binding proved magical and unbreakable, the god's hand would pay the price for the deception. The gods looked at each other. No one moved, except Tyr, the god of justice, who had fed Fenrir every day while the wolf grew, who understood that some obligations are owed even to the thing you fear, held out his right hand and placed it between Fenrir's teeth. Gleipnir was tied. Fenrir pulled. The ribbon held. He pulled harder, with everything he had, and the ribbon held the way. Impossible things hold, not by opposing force, but by having no force to oppose, no tension to break, simply an absence of breakability. Fenrir understood. He closed his jaws. Tyr lost his right hand at the wrist. He did not cry out. The old poems present this with remarkable brevity. Just the fact, stated plainly, without decoration. Tyr lost his hand. It was the price of what had been done. He had known going in that it was the price, and he had put his hand in the wolf's mouth anyway, because the obligation was real and his commitment to it was genuine. The gods dragged Fenrir, who was now enormous, straining against a binding that should not be able to hold him but did, to a remote place, and secured him there with a sword propped in his mouth to keep his jaws open, and there he remained, waiting, because Fenrir also knew what was coming. The wolf had been born knowing, the same way Odin had been born knowing, and the ribbon held. But it grew thinner with every century that passed, and the end it had been made to delay was always getting closer. Chapter 18. The Aesir Magic. When Freya came to Asgard as part of the peace agreement, she brought something with her that would change the nature of Asgard permanently. She brought cider. The Vana magic that had caused so much trouble when the witch Heathen had practiced it in Asgard was now being offered openly by one of the most powerful practitioners of it in any of the worlds, and Freya taught it to those who wanted to learn, including Odin. This is unusual enough in the Norse tradition that later commentators tied themselves in considerable knots over it. because Sade was associated primarily with women, and a male practitioner of Sade was called Urgi, a word carrying connotations of unmanliness, of having crossed a boundary that warrior culture considered important. Odin crossed it without apparent concern. The power of cedar, the ability to perceive and influence the threads of fate, to see what was woven, and sometimes to pull at the weaving and change what would come, was too useful to refuse on the grounds of its social classification. He learned from Freyja, the god of wisdom, adding the god of magic's tools to his existing arsenal. The runes, the mead, the knowledge from the well, becoming something more complete, more capable, more versatile. What Freya got from this exchange, beyond the goodwill of the most powerful being in Asgard, is less explicitly stated. But she got Folkvangri, the field where her half of the war dead came to her. She got the right to choose first. Before the Valkyries chose for Odin, before the Ainur were gathered for Valhalla, Freyja took her share. Why the god of wisdom, the architect of the army for Ragnarök, would give anyone the right to choose before him? This question suggests that the relationship between Odin and Freyja was more equal than their formal positions implied. Or it suggests that Odin had seen from Mimir's well exactly how many warriors he needed and how many Freyja's field would hold, and that the numbers worked out. He was always calculating, even generosity. Chapter 19, Bald. Now we arrive at the thing that Frigg had seen from before it happened, the thing that Odin had known from Mimir's well, the thing that Loki would cause and Odin would fail to prevent, and which would set in motion the final sequence of events that led to the end of everything. Baldur was beautiful. This is not a metaphor for goodness, that the two qualities traveled together in him. He was literally, physically, supernaturally beautiful, the most beautiful thing in any of the 9 worlds. A presence in a room that changed the quality of light, a laugh that made other laughter sound like an earlier draft of what laughter was supposed to be. He was kind. He was loved. Every being in all the 9 worlds, the old stories say, loved Baldur. Gods and dwarves and giants and elves and human beings and animals and trees and stones and rivers. All of them loved him because there was nothing in him to resist, nothing to fear, nothing that produced the guarded reaction that other divine beings consistently produced. He was Odin's son. His mother was Frigg. He had been a child once, and Odin and Frigg had watched him grow the way parents watch a child who is too good for the world he is growing into, with pride and with a particular sadness that is the specific grief of people who know how things end. And then Baldur began to dream. The dreams were bad. The first night, a dream of darkness where there should have been light. The second night, something worse. The third night, something he could not fully recall when he woke, but that left him gray-faced and quiet in a way he had never been before. Odin went to the edge of the world. He rode Sleipnir down into Hel's realm, the 8-legged gray horse carrying him past the gates and into the mist-gray country of the ordinary dead. And he found a grave there, a mound of earth above a Volder, a dead seeress, a prophetess, and he spoke the runes over the mound and called her back. She came, reluctantly. The dead do not particularly enjoy being recalled. "Who are you?" she asked the hooded figure. He did not say his name. "A wanderer, a man who wants to know what the dreams of Baldur mean." She looked at him with eyes that saw through borrowed light from a world she had left. She told him Baldur would die. She told him how. She described the preparations she could see being made in Hel's realm for the arrival of the most beloved of all beings, the gold and the feasting and the great chair being set with exceptional care for a guest that Hel herself was looking forward to welcoming. Odin asked more questions. She answered fewer of them. "You are not a wanderer," she said at last. I know the shape of your questions. Only Odin asks questions that bend this way. He confirmed it. Then we are done, she said. I will not speak again until Ragnarök demands it. She went back into the ground. Odin rode back to Asgard. He said nothing to anyone about what he had heard. Frigg, who had also known, had been doing something while Odin was gone. She had traveled through all the worlds. She had spoken to everything that existed, every animal, every plant, every stone, every metal, every disease, every poison, every fire. And she had extracted from all of them an oath, a promise not to harm Balder. Everything said yes, because everything loved him. Because the oath was easy to give when the thing being protected was the most beloved being in existence. She almost got everything. She missed one thing, the mistletoe. It was young, she told herself later. Younger than the others she had asked, too young to take a serious oath from, too slight and too small to be a real threat regardless. She moved past it without stopping. She should have stopped. In Asgard, the gods discovered Baldr's new invulnerability with the enthusiasm of people who rarely get good news. They threw things at him, not maliciously. The way you test a thing that cannot be broken, with growing delight, hurling spears and shooting arrows and striking with swords and watching everything bounce away from Baldr's laughing form, each test confirming what Frigg's oath-taking had accomplished. Baldur was safe. Nothing could hurt him. Except Loki, standing at the edge of the gathering, watched this with an expression the old poems do not describe in detail, because the expression was complicated enough that description would have diluted it. Loki knew that Frigg had done this. He transformed himself into an old woman. He went to Frigg. He asked her in the old woman's voice whether the rumors were true, whether everything had really sworn not to harm Baldur. Yes, Frigg said. Everything except the mistletoe, which was too young and too harmless to bother with. She said this without suspicion. Because why would she be suspicious of an old woman curious about a piece of good news? Loki thanked her. He went to find the mistletoe. He found it growing on the west side of Valhalla, still young, still soft, still more a sprout than a real plant. He cut it. He shaped it into something that could be thrown, sharpened it perhaps, or simply formed it into a dot, a small point of the one substance in existence that had not promised not to harm Baldur. He brought it to where the games were still ongoing. He found Hother's twin brother, who was blind. He was standing at the edge of the gathering, not participating, because what use was it to throw things at your brother when you could not see your brother? Loki offered to help. Here, he said, I will guide your arm through this. It is only a small twig, a bit of mistletoe. Join in the fun. Hulf, who loved his brother, who wanted to participate, who trusted the voice of someone who offered help he needed. He reached out his hand. He took the mistletoe dot. He felt Loki guide his arm. He threw. The mistletoe struck Baldur. Baldur fell. He died. The silence that followed his fall was the longest silence in the history of any world. It lasted long enough for the assembled gods to understand what had happened, long enough for the particular quality of Baldur lying still to clarify itself as something permanent rather than something to do with the game. He did not get up. He never got up again. The grief that moved through Asgard that day was not the grief of beings who had lost someone they expected to lose eventually. It was the grief of people who had believed something was safe, who had done everything possible to make something safe, who had seen all the preparations confirmed and ratified, and who had still lost. Frigg had obtained every oath. She had missed one plant. Odin stood over his son's body and wept in a way that the old poems treat with great care, not with excessive elaboration, but with the specific observation that the grief of the All-Father was different from the grief of the other gods. because he knew why it had happened. He knew who had done it. He knew why Loki had done it, in the deep structural sense of why. That this was the first move in a sequence of events that could not now be stopped. That Baldr's death was not a tragedy that had interrupted the story, but a tragedy that was the story, but a tragedy that was the story beginning to arrive at its end. He knew what was coming, and he wept anyway. Chapter 20, Hermern's Ride. They put Baldur on his ship. Hringhorni was the name of the great ship, the largest ship ever built in any world, and they dragged it to the shore and prepared to launch it with Baldur's body on a funeral pyre aboard it. Nanna, Baldur's wife, looked at the ship. She looked at her husband's body. She climbed onto the pyre. She died there on the ship, not from fire, but from grief. The old stories say this with remarkable directness. Her heart burst, and it was understood without extensive commentary that grief of sufficient intensity is not a metaphor for death, but an actual cause of it. They burned the ship. Thor waded into the water and consecrated the pyre with Malsamere, and a dwarf who got too close to the ship was inadvertently kicked into the fire by Thor, who did not notice him in time. The ship burned. Baldur was gone. But before the fire, Frigg had spoken. She asked, was there anyone willing to ride the road to Hel and ask the goddess of death to release Baldur? Was there anyone willing to go into the realm of the dead and negotiate for the return of what had been lost? Hermod, one of Odin's sons, stepped forward. He took Sleipnir, Odin's eight-legged horse, the horse that could go between worlds, the horse that could enter Hel's realm and leave again. He rode for 9 nights, through valleys so dark there was no light at all, through a country where darkness had the particular quality of having been dark so long it had given up any expectation of light. He crossed Jul, the river that rings Hel's realm, where a maiden named Moldera tended the bridge, and asked him why a living man was crossing into the land of the dead. He told her who he was and why he had come. She pointed him through the gates. Cerberus is not the Norse gate guardian. What guards the entrance to Hel in the Norse telling is named Garm, a great hound, blood-stained, chained at a cave called Nippehellair, who will break free at Ragnarök and who watches the entrance with a particular quality of attention. Hermod rode through. He found Baldur. Baldur was seated in the highest place in Hel's hall, in the chair that had been prepared for him with exceptional care. He looked, himself, not tormented, not diminished, not transformed by death into something different from what he had been in life. He was Baldur, beautiful and kind, in the place where the dead live. Hermod rode up to him. He talked with his brother through the night. In the morning he went to Hel. He knelt before the goddess, half living flesh and half dead, the line of division running straight down her body from the top of her head to the soles of her feet. He begged for Baldur's release. Hel considered this for a long time. She was not cruel. She was simply bound by the principle that what came to her stayed. The dead were hers, not temporarily, not on loan. The entire cosmic order rested on the permanence of death, the way the entire cosmic order rested on the world tree standing, on the sun crossing the sky, on the wolf staying bound. But she made an offer. If everything in the 9 worlds weeps for Baldur, Hel said, if every being and every stone and every tree and everything that exists sheds a tear of genuine grief for him, then I will release him. If everything weeps, it will be proof that his loss is truly the loss it appears to be, a wound in the world, not merely a wound in those who loved him. Hermod returned to Asgard. He told the gods what Hel had offered, and the gods sent messengers to every corner of every world, asking everything that existed to weep for Bald. Everything did. Men and women wept. Animals wept, which is not a thing they typically do. Trees, when the wind moved through them, produced the sound of weeping. Stones, touched by the morning dew that condensed on their cold surfaces, wept in the way that stones are capable of weeping, which is quietly and without drama. The messengers traveled everywhere. Everything said yes, everything wept, until a cave. In a cave somewhere in a distant part of the worlds, a messenger found a figure sitting alone, a giantess who gave her name as Thok, which means thanks or gratitude with the particular Norse quality of understatement. She listened to the request. She declined. Balder never gave me anything, she said. What do I get from weeping for him? Let hell keep what she has. She would not weep. And because she would not weep, because one being among all beings in all the 9 worlds refused, the condition was not met. Balder stayed in hell. The messengers returned to Asgard. They reported the failure, and Odin looked at the face of the giantess in the cave, the one who had refused and understood what Loki had done. Loki had guided the mistletoe dart, and Loki had disguised himself as a giantess to refuse the tear that would have brought Balder home. Chapter 21. Loki bound, Loki found. He knew what was coming. He had always known, the same way Odin always knew, through a different mechanism, a different depth of understanding, but arriving at the same place. He knew that what he had done would not be absorbed, would not be explained away, would not be forgiven in the way earlier mischief had been forgiven. He had killed Balder. He had prevented Balder's return. These were not the acts of a trickster who went too far. These were acts of someone who had chosen a side in the final conflict and was no longer pretending otherwise. He transformed himself into a salmon. He hid in a pool at the base of a waterfall in a remote mountain range and waited, moving between the cold deep water and the light at the surface, the way a creature lives that has become most comfortable in the space between being found and being invisible. But Odin had the ravens. Odin saw everything from Helitjev. The gods came to the waterfall. Loki, sensing them coming, leaped from the water and tried to get past them, and Thor caught him mid-leap, caught him the way you catch a salmon jumping, which is with a speed and a grip that the salmon does not expect to be possible from something that large. He held on to Loki by the tail. This is why salmon taper toward their tails. In the old stories, this is where physical facts about the world come from. The particular anatomy of specific creatures traced back to specific moments in the mythology. The way blood in the water produces a specific type of current. The way mountains are shaped by things that happened before anyone was there to name them. They took Loki to a cave, not hell, not Fenrir's island, a cave. They killed his son Nafi and used the boy's entrails as chains. The old stories are explicit about this. The darkness of it stated plainly, because the Norse tradition does not sanitize its darkness, and they bound Loki to 3 stones within the cave, face up, helpless. Skadi, the giantess who had come to Asgard after her father's death seeking compensation and had received a husband and a laugh, placed a serpent above Loki's face. The serpent dripped venom. His wife Sigyn stayed. She held a bowl above his face to catch the drops. When the bowl filled, she turned to empty it. While she was gone, the venom struck his face. The stories say that Loki's convulsions from the pain caused earthquakes in Midgard. He would lie there until Ragnarök. He would lie there while Frigg sat at her spinning in Fensalir. He would lie there while Thor drove his goat chariot across the sky fighting giants. He would lie there while Odin sent the ravens out each morning and received them back each evening and walked the halls of Valhalla watching the Einherjar fight. He would lie there getting angrier, and the binding would hold. until the day it didn't. Chapter 22, Vana. Vata. Vata. Vata, the binding. Before Loki fled, before the final judgment was made, Odin had already begun the next step. He had a son with the giantess Rindr, Vali, born to avenge Balder. The old tradition is precise about this. Vali was born specifically, deliberately, for a single purpose: to kill Hotha, the blind god who had thrown the mistletoe dart that killed his brother. Hother had not known what he was doing. He had been deceived. He was innocent in the most literal sense. He had been told he was participating in a game, and he had participated, and the thing in his hand had been a weapon without his knowing. Odin knew this. He had Hotha killed anyway. One night old when Vali was born. The old poems say he did not wash his hands, did not comb his hair, did not pause for anything before carrying out his purpose. This is the hardest thing in Odin's story to sit with. Not the eye, not the hanging, not the strategic sacrifice of countless heroes he sent to Valhalla before their time. This, ordering the death of an innocent son to pay the cosmic debt of Balder's death, because the order of things required that blood answered blood, that every death had a balance, and Balder's death had to be balanced by something. Odin gave the command. Vali carried it out. He held Hotha accountable for what Hotha had done unknowingly, because the alternative, leaving Balder's death unanswered, was cosmically impermissible. Justice in the Norse tradition is not about intent. It is about order. Odin understood order better than anything in existence. He also understood from Mimir's well, from the runic knowledge he had pulled from Yggdrasil's roots, that there were things he could not make right and things he had to do anyway. He lived with that. He had been living with it since the moment he walked away from the well with one eye. Chapter 23. What the Seer Says. Saw. There is a poem called the Voluspa, the prophecy of the seeress, in which Odin calls up a dead Vola and asks her to tell him the history of the world and its end. She tells him. She begins at the very beginning, before memory, before the frost giants, before even the void, and she walks him through everything: the making of the worlds, the gifts to the first humans, the first war, the death of Kvasa, the binding of Loki, and she arrives at Ragnarök. She tells him what she sees. The brothers will fight each other, she says. The uncles will violate the bonds of kin. The world will be hard. An axe age, a sword age. Shields will be cleft before the world goes headlong. No man will have mercy on another. 3 roosters will crow. Fiha, the red rooster, will crow for the giants. The golden rooster will crow in the high-ceilinged hall of Valhalla. Gullinkambi, crowing to wake the Ainur for the final battle. And a 3rd rooster, soot red in the halls beneath the earth. Yggdrasil will shake. The mountain giant will tremble. The ash tree will groan. The old tree will quiver as Jormungandr finally writhes free of the deep water. Fenrir's chain will break. The wolf will run free with his mouth open, the upper jaw touching the sky and the lower jaw dragging the earth, and he would gape even wider if there were room. Naglfar will sail, the ship made from the dead, built from their uncut nails, crewed by giants and by Loki, who will take the helm. Surt will come from the south. Fire from Muspelheim. Fire so absolute that the sun itself will seem dim beside it, coming north across the bridge, Bifrost, the Rainbow Bridge, the most beautiful thing in the 9 worlds, which will crack under the weight of Surt and his fire giants crossing it. The gods will meet them on the plain of Virgvith. Odin will ride at the head of the Ainur. He will face Fenrir. The wolf's jaws will close. Odin will be swallowed. His son Vithar will avenge him, wearing the great shoe built from centuries of leather scraps left by human cobblers, the shoe that had been preparing itself for this single moment. Vithar will kill Fenrir. Thor will kill Jormungandr. He will take 9 steps. He will fall to the serpent's venom. Freyr, who had given away his great sword, the sword that fights on its own, that moves by itself through the battle, who had given it away for a giantess's love, will face Surt without it. Without the sword, Freyr will fall. Tyr, one-handed Tyr, who had lost his hand in the binding of Fenrir, will fight Garm the great hound that had been chained at the gate of Hel and will now be free. They will kill each other. Heimdall, the watchman who had blown the horn that woke everyone to the beginning of the end. Heimdall, who could hear the grass growing and the wool growing on sheep's backs, who had blown Gjallarhorn with the last of his breath, will fight Loki. They will kill each other. Surt's fire will cover everything. The earth will sink into the sea. The stars will fall. Smoke will rise. Flames will play against the sky. And then the seeress pauses. She says, after the fire, the earth will rise from the sea again, green, unscarred. The fields will grow without sowing. Balr will come back from hell. Hertha will come back with him. A new sun will rise, the daughter of the old sun, who will ride her mother's path when her mother falls. The gods who survive, Vidar, Vali, Bothir, and Modni. Thor's sons who will carry their father's hammer between them. Balder and Hothin reconciled, will meet in the grass of the place that had been Asgard, and they will find in the grass the golden gaming pieces they had played with before everything burned. 2 humans will have survived, hidden in the branches of Yggdrasil, Lif and Lifthrasir, life and the will to live, and they will emerge into the new world and repopulate it. And from somewhere new a mighty one will come, from above, to the judgment that rules. This is where the poem becomes uncertain, as if the seeress herself is reaching the edge of what she can see, the point at which even prophetic vision blurs into the general possibility of things that might follow from things. Odin listened to all of this. He listened in the poem the way he always listened, patiently, precisely, noting every detail, confirming what he already knew from Mimir's well against what the seeress added from the place where prophetic knowledge and the record of the dead's witness combined. Then she stopped speaking. The old poem ends with the seeress sinking, going back down, back into the ground. Odin was left with what he had heard, which was what he had known. He had known since the well. Now he had heard it said aloud in the precise and structured form of a formal prophecy, every detail confirmed, every name and sequence and consequence accounted for. He went back to Asgard. He fed the wolves. He sent the ravens. He sat in the high seat and looked out over all 9 worlds in the gray light of a morning that was, in the cosmic sense, closer to the last morning than to the first. He kept going. Chapter 24. The Cygnus Begin. The world did not end all at once. The world ended in the way that real things end. Slowly, with signs that could be ignored if you chose to ignore them, with warnings that could be rationalized, with small shifts that preceded the large shifts by enough time that people convinced themselves the large shifts would not come. Odin saw the signs because Odin saw everything. He saw the binding on Fenrir growing thinner, century by century, the silk ribbon that was stronger than iron gradually becoming something more fragile, not breaking yet, but losing the quality of absolute holding that it had possessed when first tied. He saw Jormungandr moving in the deep ocean, felt the tremors through Yggdrasil's roots in the way that a very large creature moving in a connected system disturbs everything connected to it. The serpent was not yet free, but it was restless in a way it had not been before, and the tides of the Midgard Sea were doing things that human sailors noticed without understanding. Currents running differently, waters that had been predictable becoming unpredictable. He heard Loki's convulsions growing stronger, the earthquakes that Sigurd's absences produced. Each time she turned to empty the bowl, each time the venom struck and Loki thrashed against the bindings had become more powerful with each passing age, as if the binding itself was losing efficacy, as if the purpose of holding Loki in place was becoming harder to maintain, not through any single dramatic failure, but through the gradual erosion of what had kept things in place. He watched Midgard. He watched human civilization, which he had invested in since the moment he and his brothers had found 2 trees on a beach and transformed them into beings capable of building and destroying, and loving and hating, and remembering and forgetting. The humans had done extraordinary things. They had built cities and written down stories and sailed to places they had no business reaching, and discovered fire and mathematics and the specific pleasure of music heard in a large space. They had also done terrible things to each other. The particular brutality that humans could achieve when the things that held societies together came apart, this was not new to Odin. He had seen it from the high seat. He had participated in it sometimes, directing it the way water is directed, making sure the violence served the purpose of producing the kind of warrior he needed rather than simply consuming everything. But in the sign's time, in the period the old poems call Fimbulwinter, the Great Winter, the 3 winters in a row with no summer between them, the brutality became something different. It became the kind of violence that feels like the world forgetting that there was ever a reason not to. Fimbulwinter descended. The snow came in a direction it should not have come from. The cold was a cold that entered houses and would not leave, that found gaps in cloaks that had been warm the season before, that settled into the bones of people who had survived many winters and told them at a level below consciousness that this winter was different. It was dark, not the normal dark of northern winters. A dark that felt personal, felt directed, felt like the light was not merely absent but had decided to leave. The wolf Skull, who had been chasing the sun across the sky since the beginning of time, caught her. The wolf Hati, who had been chasing the moon, caught him. The sky went completely dark, and in the human settlements, in the farms and the towns and the gathering places, the bonds that had held people together, the obligations of hospitality, the customs of protection, the rituals that translated abstract loyalty into daily behavior, those bonds began to fail. Brothers turned on brothers, fathers on sons. The world the old poem describes in these days is a world that has forgotten what it was for, has lost the thread that connected daily life to anything larger than the immediate need, has become purely transactional in the worst sense. Every relationship reduced to its minimum, every obligation dissolved unless enforced by immediate threat. Odin watched this from his high seat. He had known it was coming. He had tried to prepare. He had built Valhalla and filled it with the best warriors who had ever lived, training them every day for exactly this moment. And now the moment was arriving, and there was nothing more he could add to what he had built, nothing more he could sacrifice that he had not already sacrificed, nothing more he could know that he had not already paid to know. He called the Einherjar. In Valhalla, the gold rooster Gullinkambi crowed. The warriors of Odin's army woke for the last time. They armed themselves. They had been training for this every day since their deaths. They had been killed in the morning and restored in the evening, fought and bled and risen and fought again, for the specific purpose of being ready for exactly the battle that was now beginning. They went out. through the 540 doors of Valhalla, 800 warriors per door, the old poems say. The mathematics of it adding up to an army whose size is deliberately, cosmically beyond any normal reckoning. Odin rode at their head. On Sleipnir, the 8-legged horse, the horse that had been born from Loki's trick and given to Odin, and had carried him between worlds and into hell and across the sky, for the length of everything. He carried Gungnir, the spear that never missed. He rode toward the plain of Yggdrasil, where everything would end, and behind him came the greatest army ever assembled, every warrior who had ever fallen in a way that showed they were worth choosing, every hero the Valkyries had gathered from 1,000 generations of human warfare. The Bifrost cracked behind them as Surt's fire giants crossed it. The earth shook as Fenrir's footsteps hit it, free at last, his vast jaws describing the space between sky and earth, his shadow falling across everything. The sea rose as Jormungandr came ashore. The serpent's body was long enough that when its head was on land, its tail was still deep in the ocean, still holding the shape it had held for so many ages, the circle broken at last. Naglfar was on the water. Loki was at the helm. His face was new-scarred, the venom of centuries having taken what it had taken from him in that cave, his patience having burned away everything but the very core of what he was, and what he was at core was the thing that had always been there. The agent of change, the force that would not be contained, the principle that opposed any system that thought itself permanent. He had wanted to burn it all down since the beginning. He had waited. He had played the long game, the longer game even than Odin had played, and now the wait was over. The armies met. Chapter 25, Ragnarök. The plain of Yggdrasil is described as extending 100 leagues in every direction. It would need to be. What gathered there on the last day from every direction at once was everything that had been building since the first frost giant was made from the ice of the void, every antagonism, every long-running war, every deferred vengeance, every chained and bound thing, finally unchained and unbound. On one side, the Einherjar of Valhalla, Odin's gathered army. Frey's warriors from Folkvangre, the gods themselves. On the other, Fenrir, Jormungandr, Surt and the fire giants, Loki and his children, the giants of Jotunheim, Garm the great hound of hell, finally free from his chain, the serpent that had encircled the world. The noise it produced is described in the old poems as something that could not be described, only gestured at, a sound that filled every place in every world simultaneously. The sound of everything at once, which is a sound too large for any surviving account to capture accurately. Odin rode toward Fenrir, the wolf that was going to kill him. He had known this wolf since it was a pup. He had watched it grow. He had been present at the binding. He had known since Mimir's well that this specific animal was the one destined to end him, and he had not killed it when it was small enough to kill. And he had watched it become too large to kill, and he had built the silk ribbon to hold it, and he had built the silk ribbon to hold it, and the ribbon had held for as long as it could. Now it was free, and Odin rode toward it. The mouth was open. The jaws stretched from earth to sky, and Odin rode Sleipnir straight into that open space, and Gungnir flew, the always accurate, the never missing, and it struck the wolf, and the wolf swallowed him, the jaws closed. Odin, the All-Father, the one-eyed wanderer, the god who had given an eye for wisdom and hung on the world tree for 9 nights and drunk from the well of total knowledge, the god who had made the world from a murdered giant and shaped human beings from trees and built an army from the dead, was gone for a moment that lasted both no time at all and longer than any other moment. He was simply gone. And then Vidar came, the silent god, the son born to be here at this specific moment. He wore the great shoe, built from all the centuries of leather scraps that human cobblers had left at the edges of their offcuts, prepared across 1,000 years of mortal craft without any of the cobblers understanding what they were contributing to. He placed his foot on the wolf's lower jaw. He seized the upper jaw with both hands. He pulled. He tore Fenrir's mouth apart. The wolf that had killed Odin died screaming in a way that no wolf had ever screamed before, and Vidar stood in the silence that followed with blood on his hands and a look that the old poems do not describe, because a look like that cannot be described. He had done what he was made for. On the other side of the battle, Thor and Jormungandr had found each other. The serpent that had grown large enough to encircle the world that Odin had dropped into the ocean all those ages ago when it was small enough to hold in 2 hands, that had lain in the cold, deep dark growing for centuries, had finally risen. Thor and the serpent had met before. On Hymir's boat, the fishing line going taut with something too large for any ordinary sea to hold, the hook in the serpent's jaw. Hymir cutting the line before Thor could deliver the blow. In Utgard Loki's hall, the serpent disguised as an old gray cat, and Thor lifting one paw from the floor, and the giants going white with terror at how close the world serpent had come to being moved. This time there was nothing between them. Thor swung Mjolnir. The serpent struck. The hammer fell again and again, each blow landing with the force of the storm god's complete strength, undiluted, unrestrained, and the serpent absorbed them and kept striking, each strike carrying the accumulated venom of every century it had spent in the dark water, the venom that had been building since it had first been made. Thor killed Jormungandr. He stood over its body. He took 9 steps. The venom was already in him, in his blood, in his breath, in the air around him that had become saturated with the serpent's last exhalation. He took 9 steps away from the body, and on the 9th step, the strength left him all at once, the way the string goes out of a bow that has finally broken, and he fell. Tyr and Garm killed each other. The great hound of hell and the one-handed god of justice, who had once placed his hand in Fenrir's mouth and lost it without crying out, they fought and they ended each other, and their deaths fell in the same moment, balanced as Tyr had always believed that costs and consequences should be balanced. Freyr insert. Freyr without his sword, the sword he had traded away for love, for the giantess Gurthon, who had been worth it to him. The trade he had made with full understanding of what he was giving up, knowing that on this specific day he would need it and would not have it. He fought Surt with a stag's antler. He fought longer than he should have been able to fight without the sword. He lost. Surt's fire swept across the field and across the 9 worlds, consuming everything that could be consumed, burning down the structures that had held everything in place since Odin and his brothers had lifted Ymir's skull to make the sky. Heimdall and Loki killed each other at the same moment, the watchman and the trickster, the one who saw everything coming and sounded the alarm, and the one who had been the agent of everything that required alarming. The fire spread, the earth sank, the stars fell. The sea rose over everything. And then there was water, just water. The way there had been void before the void became something else. Chapter 26. The New World. The earth rose from the water. It rose the way things rise that have been below water for a long time, changed by the immersion, cleaner, its surface stripped of everything that had accumulated, its essential structure intact beneath what the water had taken. It was green. The fields grew without sowing. This detail is the one the old poets return to with what seems like genuine wonder, as if out of all the extraordinary things they were describing, the thing that moved them was the smallest, grain, growing without anyone planting it, in a world that had just survived fire and flood, and the deaths of gods. The gods who remained, Vidar and Vali, the sons who had been born specifically to survive this, and Mother and Magni, Thor's sons carrying their father's hammer between them, and Balder and Hother, who came back from Hel. They met in the grass of what had been Asgard. The hall was gone. The walls were gone. The high seat from which Odin had watched all 9 worlds was gone. But in the grass where it had been, they found the golden gaming pieces. The pieces from the board games the gods had played in the age before everything burned. The gold pieces that had been scattered when the games ended, now found again in the new grass of a world beginning. They picked them up. They were quiet, the old poem says. The gods who remained sat together in the grass and did not speak much, because there was not much to say, because the loss of what had been lost was too recent and too total to be addressed in words. But they were also alive, which is its own extraordinary thing, and the morning of the new world was around them. 2 humans came out of the tree, Lif and Yggdrasil, life and the will to live. They had been inside Yggdrasil, the world tree, which had shaken and groaned and survived. The great ash tree had survived Ragnarök, had endured the fire and the water, and the 2 humans who had sheltered inside it had survived with it. They walked out into the new morning, and the new sun rose. Not the old sun. The old sun had been caught by Skoll and consumed. But the daughter of the old sun, who had been born while her mother was still alive specifically for this purpose, specifically to carry on when the mother could not, rose into the new sky. She lit the new world, and where the light fell, the grain was already growing. The old poem describing the ending and the new beginning ends with something that scholars have debated for centuries. After describing the new world and the returning gods and the golden gaming pieces in the grass, the seeress describes a hall she sees standing, more beautiful than the sun, thatched with gold. It stands in Gimle. There shall the worthy rulers live and spend their days in happiness forever. And then, a few lines later, there comes the mighty one to the judgment from above. And then, from below a dragon flies, the black serpent, from me the fuel. And then the poem ends. The seeress sinks. The account is done. The interpretation of what that last mighty one is, and what judgment, and whether the new world is better or simply different. These are questions the poem leaves open, as all the best stories leave the questions that matter most open. What we know is that the dragon is still flying, that darkness is still present even in the new world, that the golden hall exists, and that something is coming, has always been coming, will arrive at the appointed time. Chapter 27. What Odin Knew. Let us come back to the beginning, to the thing we began with, the thing that defines everything. Odin knew how he died. From the moment he drank from Mimir's well, he knew. He knew Fenrir's name. He knew the plain of Yggdrasil. He knew the smell of the morning when the rooster crowed. He knew the 9 steps Thor would take and where they would end. He knew it all. And knowing it all, he did everything anyway. He hung from the world tree for 9 nights. Not because he didn't know it would hurt, because the knowledge he might gain was worth the suffering required to gain it. He gave his eye, not because he didn't understand what he was losing, because what was on the other side of that loss was worth more than the eye could ever have been. He built Valhalla. He spent uncountable centuries selecting and gathering and training an army, not because he thought the army would prevent what was coming, but because the army might make the new world possible, because Thor's 9 steps required everything that came before them to make them worth taking. He loved his sons, knowing what would happen to them, knowing he would lose them, loving them not naively, not blindly, but with full knowledge of every specific loss that love would produce, and choosing it anyway because the alternative, a life without love, without the building and the choosing and the genuine investment in what you cannot fully protect, was not a life he was willing to live. He walked through Midgard in disguise, testing people, choosing heroes, giving gifts, taking them back when the time came, doing what necessity required, even when necessity required terrible things, and carrying the weight of those terrible things in the way that a God who can see everything carries weight, completely, permanently, without the mercy of forgetting. He was not good in the simple sense. He was the opposite of simple. He was the being who understood that the world is not saved by beings of absolute goodness, any more than a house is held up by a single beam. What holds up a house, what holds up a world, is the willingness of every structural element to bear its portion of the weight, to carry what is assigned without being able to put it down, to hold until the last moment, after which the holding is no longer required. He held from the beginning to the end, one-eyed, room-marked mead drunk on divine inspiration and ordinary mead both, walking in disguise through the worlds he had made, building in the only direction he could build, toward a future he had already seen, toward an end he had already accepted, toward the wolf's jaws he had known about since Mimir's well, riding toward them on a horse born from a trick, carrying a spear that never missed, leading an army of the dead. He rode toward the wolf, not because he thought he could win, because that was his part of the weight. Chapter 28. The Things He Left Behind. What does a god leave behind? The obvious answers: myths, stories, the names for things. Wednesday is Odin's day in the old calendar, the day of the one-eyed wanderer, the day of wisdom and uncertainty, and the sense that you are never quite seeing the whole picture because the whole picture is too large to see. He left the runes, not for the gods. The gods did not need them after Ragnarök. He left them for human beings, who found them carved on stones and bone pieces and the handles of tools, who used them not fully understanding what they were, who translated them into alphabets and into the sense that writing itself is magical, that putting marks on a surface creates something more permanent than the moment that produced the marks. He left the ravens, Hugin and Munin, thought and memory, the two things he feared losing most, given wings and sent out each morning, carried forward into every world and every story, and every time anyone sits quietly with their own mind and follows a thought to its end, or tries to hold a memory they are afraid of losing. He left the mead, the ability of language to carry truth in forms that are not destroyed by time, the way a story told once in a longhouse in the dark of a Norse winter survives to be told in a room with electric light on the other side of the world 1,000 years later, carrying the same essential truth, the same emotional weight, the same quality of genuine encounter with something real. He left Yggdrasil standing, the world tree, shaken but intact, the thing that holds all the worlds together, that has 3 sets of roots drinking from 3 different sources, the well of Urdat, the Norns weave beside, Mimir's well of memory and wisdom, and the bitter dark waters of Niflheim that feed the dragon gnawing at the base. 3 sources, 3 kinds of nourishment: the past, the memory, and the deep cold dark that reminds everything alive of what it came from and what it will return to. He left the question. The poem ends with the mighty one coming to judgment and the dragon still flying. And this is not a failure of the myth. This is the myth being honest about what myths can honestly tell you, not what comes after everything, not the shape of the thing that is genuinely beyond, but the quality of continuing, the fact that even after the fire and the flood and the new grass and the golden pieces found in the new ground, there is still a dragon. There is always still a dragon. The question is not whether the dragon exists. The question is what you are willing to pay to understand it, and what you will do with what you learn, and whether you will keep going when what you learn tells you something you would rather not know. Odin asked that question. Every morning of his existence, from the moment he gained the runes to the moment the wolf's jaws closed, he asked it. He answered it the same way every time. With the ravens, with the eye already given, with the spear thrown straight at the thing he knew would win. That is the story of Odin the All-Father, not the story of a god who knew everything and therefore suffered nothing. The story of a god who knew everything and therefore understood that knowledge does not excuse you from the weight. It only tells you exactly how heavy it is. And still he carried it. And still he rode. The whisper at the funeral of Balder, when the great ship burned and the grief of all the worlds gathered at the shoreline. Odin leaned over his son's body before the fire was lit. He whispered something. No one heard it. No one was meant to. The only question the seeress could not answer, the only thing that tripped her in her long and precise accounting of the history and future of everything, was what Odin said into his dead son's ear on that pyre. What do you say to a son you could not save? What do you say when you knew it was coming and couldn't stop it, and did your best with what you had, and your best was not enough? What do you say when the thing you love most was taken by the thing you built alongside it? Because the world is like that. Because the fire that lights the hall and warms the people in it is the same fire that will one day take the hall. We don't know. We will never know. That is the point. Some things that pass between a father and a son are too private for myth, too real for story. They live in the specific moment, in the specific breath, in the cold air of the shore with the fire beginning and the sea beyond it going on forever. But the ravens came back every evening, thought and memory. The world kept turning and the ravens kept coming back, and Odin kept receiving them, kept listening, kept knowing, until the wolf came. And the wolf, too, is part of the story. Because without the wolf there is no sun coming back from hell. Without the fire there is no new green earth. Without the end there is no beginning that comes after it. This is what Odin knew. This is what he whispered. Not the words, but the shape of it. The shape of knowing that the loss is real and the new morning is also real, and that these two truths do not cancel each other out, but exist together, always. The way the ravens fly out each morning into the same sky, one carrying what you think and one carrying what you remember, and come back in the evening with everything they found. Odin was the god of wisdom. He was the god of war. He was the god of poetry and death and magic, and the particular kind of knowing that costs more than almost anything is worth. He was a father. He was a husband. He was a wanderer who could never fully stay anywhere because there was always something else to know, always another door, always another price worth paying if what was on the other side was real enough. He gave his eye for the shape of everything. He hung 9 nights for the laws beneath the laws. He rode into the wolf's open mouth for the 9 steps his son would take on the other side of a battle. His son would win. He was not good in the simple sense. He was something better than good. He was genuine. He was, in his one-eyed, rune-scarred, mead-carrying, wandering way, exactly what he was. All-Father. The one who made the world from what was available, who filled it with beings made from trees and gifted them fire and language and the capacity to suffer and the capacity to endure, who watched over them from a high seat and walked among them in disguise and built them an afterlife worthy of the warriors they could become, who paid every price the world asked and went back for more, who loved his children with the full and terrible knowledge of what that love would cost, who rode toward the wolf on the last morning the way you would be competitive without hesitation, with the ravens on his shoulders, with the eye already given and the runes already carved and the mead already drunk, and the sword already pulled from the tree, and the ship already built, and the ribbon already tied, and the ash tree still standing, as it is standing now, as it will stand until the next fire, and after. And so, the story of Odin comes to an end. A god who gave up an eye for wisdom, hung himself from the world tree for knowledge, and spent his entire life preparing for a battle he knew he could never win. Perhaps that is why Odin has endured for more than 1,000 years. Not because he was the strongest of the gods, but because he understood that true wisdom isn't knowing how your story ends. It's choosing to face it with courage anyway. If you enjoyed this journey through Norse mythology, I'd love to know what you think. Who should we explore next, Loki, Frasier, Thor, or another legendary figure? Let me know in the comments. And if you haven't already, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to Mythborn, where the world's oldest myths are brought back to life, one story at a time. Until our paths cross again, rest well, stay curious, and may the old stories guide your dreams. Good night.